But they had also begun their revolutionary activities in Asia very early. And again, with the vital help of our government at every turn, they were carrying out their second step only a short distance behind the first one. So that by 1950, the Soviets had established communist satellite regimes in Mongolia, in North Korea, in Manchuria, and over all of the mainland of China. Their conquest of the masses of Asia by repeated application of the same formula, composed of cunning, terror, and American support, has continued steadily ever since. In 1945, for instance, an Asiatic communist named Ho Chi Minh, who had been trained in Moscow, was set up in business as a communist revolutionary in Indochina with our money, our equipment, and our moral support. By 1954, with the direct on-the-scenes help of the American Colonel Edward Lansdale and of our State Department, Ho Chi Minh and other agents of the Kremlin succeeded in throwing the French out of Vietnam and in taking over the better half of that domain for themselves. By 1956, Stalin's murderous agent, Ahmed Sukarno, was being royally welcomed and glorified in Washington as the ruler of Indonesia. And so the story went, until you will find that today the de facto control by the communists of all of Asia is virtually complete. The second step of their global strategy has been accomplished. And of course, the communists have been moving steadily forward on their third step, especially since about 1950. The surrounding of the United States, as they put it, involves their establishing practical control of Western Europe. This has already gone so far today, with the governments of England and of France having been in communist hands for years, that even the government of West Germany is now dominated by communist influences almost as much as is our own. And even the strength of Franco's government in Spain is being undermined by, of all things, pro-communist liberal movements within the Catholic Church. This surrounding process involves the taking over by the communists of the northern ledge of Africa, and then all of that continent. It involves the establishment of communist or crypto-communist regimes in Canada and in all of Latin America. In that connection, it is worth noting that since 1945, Nelson Rockefeller, Milton Eisenhower, John Kennedy with his so-called Alliance for Progress, and other molders and executors of our State Department policy have contrived to have billions of dollars of American taxpayers' money spent in Latin America to promote the political fortunes of those regimes and those demagogues that were pro-communist, while always leaving the anti-communists, so far as possible, holding empty bags. It is worth noting more specifically that, as a part of this strategy of encirclement, Cuba was made a very strong communist outpost. The strongly anti-communist government of the Dominican Republic was destroyed, and the lifelong communist, Romulo Betancourt, was brought back to power in Venezuela, all primarily through the direct efforts and conniving of the Eisenhower administration. And that right while these pages are being written in the spring of 1969, the present administration in Washington is using its full prestige and power to help a communist group to establish its rule over Peru. It has been the aim of the communists to achieve virtual control of the Western Hemisphere, except for the people of the United States, before closing in on this final bastion of capitalism. Simultaneously, World War II and its aftermath had given birth to the means and procedures whereby the insiders and their communist agents during the next 25 years have been establishing themselves in virtual control over almost all of the governments of the world. This has left them only one major task still to be carried out. This is to weave the almost infinite lines of their influence and power in the United States into such a straitjacket over the total body of the American people that effective resistance is no longer possible. And we shall devote the rest of this historical survey to the strategy and tactics by which they have been carrying out that task. Section 5. Several observations of a general nature seem to be in order at this point. The first is that, purely for convenience, in this second part of our story, we can usually let the communist arm that has grown so strong represent the whole conspiratorial body and simply refer, as a rule, to the communist conspiracy, although there are places where the inaccuracy of this description must be kept in mind. Second, we are now in the last stage of the struggle, my friends, and make no mistake about it. An international conspiracy which has been continuous, patient, cold-blooded, and single-minded for 6 generations, and phenomenally successful in moving toward its ultimate goal during the last 2 generations, is now confident that its final victory is close at hand, and these conspirators intend to leave nothing to chance. There is almost no limit, therefore, to the variety, the extensiveness, or the ruthless cunning of the plans, measures, and means by which they have been proceeding on their ruthless course. Third, since we cannot begin to offer a complete panoramic survey of all of these activities, we shall have to be selective and look at some 8 divisions of the communist strategy by which they have expected, quite literally, to fasten on the American people the chains of slavery. And fourth, let us make clear that from the very beginning, 200 years ago, the insiders who control this conspiracy have always counted on 3 basic means for carrying out their program. These are 1, war, 2, money, and 3, hatred. You will find one or more of these tools being utilized in every campaign of destructiveness which we might examine. But let's begin with the 3 long-range undertakings of the communists, in which each of these tools has been, respectively, the very core of their strategy. The first of these sinister schemes is to keep the American people almost perpetually involved in war, while the communists themselves always pretend to be seeking peace. It was only 5 years after the end of World War II, for instance, when we were dragged into the artfully contrived Korean affair. And the actual purposes of that involvement can be most easily realized by looking at some of its results. Eisenhower was inaugurated in January 1953. Up to May of that year, our generals in Korea were still in position to win that war quickly, decisively, and overwhelmingly. Even so careful and able a man as General Van Fleet later went on record with a public statement to that effect. Instead, Eisenhower terminated the war by the most ignominious negotiations in our nation's history, gave up entirely every purpose for which the war had supposedly been fought, and let our country betray both our South Korean allies and our own soldiers who had died fighting in a war which they were kept from winning only by orders from Washington. We left South Korea as living proof of the devastation that would be wreaked on any country which depended on the United States to save it from communism. We broke our word in the most flagrant and cruel manner to tens of thousands of Chinese and North Korean prisoners who, having been impressed into the communist armies against their will, had risked their lives to come over to our side in reliance on our promises to protect them. We left untold hundreds of our own men as helpless prisoners in the hands of their communist enemies. We reduced the prestige and moral leadership of the United States to the lowest point it had ever reached up to that time, and we gave the communists in Asia their greatest boost since our government had helped and enabled them to take over the mainland of China. All of which may help you to a better understanding of the second performance of this same show, which has been taking place in Vietnam. History not only repeats itself, but sometimes the repetition is actually planned by evil men many years in advance. There is plenty of evidence that the basic plot of the Vietnam drama, exactly as it has been acted out over the past 17 years, was carefully planned by the insiders at least as far back as 1952. There are countless ways in which our involvement in Vietnam has been used to help the communists in Europe as well as in Asia. But its effect on our domestic affairs has been of even greater benefit to the communist program. And we repeat that involvement of the United States in unceasing wars, of which the communists control both sides, has been a vital part of the communist design. The primary objective of the forces that dominate our government in being at war in Southeastern Asia or anywhere else is simply to be at war. And far from ever having wanted to win the war in Vietnam, our government has gone to tremendous lengths, both by advanced planning and in its actual conduct of the war, to give our failure to win it as much plausibility as possible. Let's look at a few facts and arguments which support these assertions. In the first place, if our objective was to save some people from communist terror and tyranny, then why not Cuba? Why did we go halfway around the world instead to fight the communists on behalf of some other small country, except to make our own difficulties in conducting the war immensely greater and more expensive? But further questions just pour out, one on top of another. Why did we spend many years in subtly destroying so many of the real anti-communist forces and leaders in South Vietnam before getting this war underway, with ourselves directly involved, except to make it that much harder for our armed forces to win? With the communists advancing all over the world, why did we choose to fight them in the one place and manner where, as General MacArthur pointed out, the odds were the heaviest against us, namely with ground forces on the mainland of Asia, except, of course, to make a protracted struggle and our failure to win it seem more plausible? Why has our government refused to let our military forces bomb Haiphong Harbor and thus put our enemies out of business for lack of equipment? Why has our government, by massive aid to the communist regimes in Eastern Europe, made it possible for these supplies to be sent to Haiphong in the first place? The answer is very simple. It's because our government has been doing everything it dared do to enable our communist enemies to uphold and carry on their side of the war. On the island of Taiwan today, there are over 500,000 well-trained, well-armed Chinese soldiers whose whole object in life is to fight the communists on the mainland of Asia. The head of their government, Chiang Kai-shek, has begged to be allowed to send them into the war in Vietnam on our side. Not only has he been emphatically denied the opportunity to do so, but it has been made clear to him that he would be prevented by force, if necessary, from carrying out any effort to fight our enemies in Asia. Why? All of the reasons given by spokesmen for our government were easily shown to be as phony as a $3 bill. The only real reason was that, with Chiang's troops on the scene in Vietnam, it would have been almost impossible to keep our armed forces with such allies from going ahead and winning the war, which is the last thing Washington wanted. For the actual objective of our involvement in Southeast Asia has not been to protect South Vietnam, but to help the international conspiracy to impose its communist rule on the American people here at home. Even at the cost of laborious repetition, let's summarize briefly just how it has served and still serves this purpose. A. War always brings more and more spending. The importance of this effect becomes obvious when you realize the amount of effort carried out in Washington trying to devise plausible ways to waste American money. That statement may shock you as much now as it shocked me 20 years ago to discover the fact to be true, and even to have bureaucrats confess to me that this was what they were doing. It is not easy to bankrupt a nation with as great a productive capacity as the United States, although several insiders within the last 5 administrations, such as Dean Acheson and Robert Strange McNamara, have made great contributions to that effort. Our involvement in the Korean War and the Vietnamese War, all of the tremendously publicized threats of nuclear war, and all of the fictitious pretenses about the military might of Soviet Russia and of Red China, have provided the most useful excuses and opportunities for pouring untold billions of dollars down the drain in a constant stream. B. War also brings bigger and bigger deficits, higher and higher taxes, and more government controls over commerce and industry. These all follow naturally and easily on the heels of wartime spending. They are made more palatable by wartime psychology, especially when new tax measures are presented with the usual falsehoods about them being temporary and only for the duration of the war. A temporary tax, of course, is like a patriotic communist. It is purely a figment of the imagination. C. The Vietnamese War has been cleverly used by the insiders to help them to destroy patriotism. In the way the war has been conducted, in the obvious lack of any desire to win it, in the loss of American lives and the disruption of American life for visibly phony reasons, in the permitted and actually encouraged sedition right here at home by the very enemies our sons are fighting in Asia, in the constant and massive flood of aid by our government to our communist enemies in Europe, in all of these developments, we have the stench of deliberate and blatant treason. And this odor is so strong in the very top circles of our national life that real patriotism is being undermined and replaced by the same doubts, confusion, and despair which are eroding all other American virtues that once were commonplace. Let us emphasize again, as something for you to keep in mind throughout this whole discussion, that all the plans and activities of the conspiracy are aimed at destruction of the old order, while they are gathering into their hands the lines of power with which their new order can be established. And a war comes in very handy as a help to that undertaking. Section 6. A second division of communist strategy, now applied to the United States as to many other countries before it, has been promotion of the prospect, the semblance, and the terror of civil war here at home. This has been accomplished by lying propaganda and ruthless agitation in the name of civil rights and by the completely phony war on poverty. Manifestations of this whole design include the following. A. The civil rights movement has been loaded from top to bottom with communists, criminals, and self-proclaimed revolutionaries. Yet almost all of them have been supported morally, physically, and financially by agencies of our government, by great church and educational organizations, and by individuals in high places who are supposed to be eminently respectable. The last three administrations have played the leading role in creating the means and the excuses for civil riots. Representatives of the clergy, both Catholic and Protestant, have condoned, encouraged, and even personally led agitation and lawlessness which were visibly parts of communist-planned and communist-controlled revolutionary movements. And Nelson Rockefeller, perennial governor of our most populous state and perennial candidate for president of the United States, was one of the heaviest financial backers of Martin Luther King, whose every action was designed to advance the communist program. B. Support of the so-called war on poverty by the same influences has been even more brazen. Rioting under this banner has been encouraged, subsidized, or actually fomented by agencies of the vast federal bureaucratic monstrosity called the Office of Economic Opportunity. But in this area also, the government's agents have had plenty of help from the private subsidizers of subversion. On July 1, 1968, the Ford Foundation gave $630,000 to an officially identified communist named Maclovio Barraza for revolutionary agitation among the ordinarily loyal and peaceful Mexican Americans in our southwestern states. And this was not even unusual enough among similar actions by the Ford, Rockefeller, and other foundations to attract any appreciable attention. While for support of the same sinister activities by highly placed individuals, you do not need to look any further than the Democratic National Convention of 1968. C. A third important part of this Civil War business has been the movement to discredit, demoralize, subvert, and either destroy or absorb into a national Gestapo the local police forces of our nation. For these local police forces, if not rendered ineffective by pressures, influences, or orders from above their ranks, are both able and willing to make abortive nonsense out of any civil war, reasonable facsimile, or separate fraction thereof, which the communist agitators might try to get underway. What's more, they know the local criminals, can recognize professional goons and agitators from the outside, and, like our men in Vietnam, all they have needed to win this war with our communist enemies was for us to take off the wraps and let them perform their duties in Vietnam as soldiers and here at home as policemen. And of course, it's the same war. But the communists have known all of this far better than the American people. So the effort to undermine our local police forces began many years ago. A major propaganda weapon of this undertaking was the charge of police brutality, which every communist was taught to shout at every feasible opportunity without the slightest regard for whether there was any truth behind it. A major action weapon of the same campaign was the formation of civilian police review boards, whereby a combination of comsimps, soft-headed sob-sisters, and political opportunists could harass and frighten the members of local police forces to the point of greatly reducing their courage, their determination to enforce the law, and their general effectiveness. These deep-laid plans have not been fully successful, however, due in large part to our own extensive campaign of recent years under the slogan, "Support Your Local Police." But the communists never let up. So now you see three new steps in the picture. And the first is simply a growing attempt to establish the equivalent of civilian police review boards under other names and various pretenses. Second, you find that governors like Rockefeller and Romney, and mayors like Lindsay of New York and Kavanaugh of Detroit, have used their full power and influence whenever necessary, and as far as they dared, to impose stultifying orders or pressures from above on the police forces of cities within their respective jurisdictions as a means of preventing the police from making early arrests of communist-controlled agitators who were inciting mobs to arson, vandalism, and murder. Third, the federal government has now stepped in behind the communist long-range plans with regard to our local police forces with very much the same strategy by which the same federal government has gradually, in blatant violation of the United States Constitution, seized control for the communists of American public education. The core of this strategy consists of grants in aid, whereby the police themselves are beguiled by actual or prospective increases in pay and by other expected perquisites into going along with various federally dominated training programs. Out of this strategy, there evolved massive measures of the federal government for gradually establishing lines of federal authority over local police forces, for gradually brainwashing the police themselves, and for creating a situation in which resistance to the trend begins to seem futile, while opportunistic acceptance of the whole scheme becomes more and more rewarding. At the present rate of this development, it will not be long now before bureaucrats in Washington will be deciding that some police sergeant in East Overshoe may not be promoted to lieutenant because he showed too much zeal and sense of duty in stopping communist-led mobs from looting and burning his town. The government has a right to control what it subsidizes, you understand, because the Supreme Court has said so. And this steady seizure of control by the federal government, and hence by the insiders within it, over our local police forces is all just another part of the total communist plan. Section 7. We have already touched in passing on the communists' use of money to serve their satanic purposes. But we need to round this topic out a bit. And our main point is that the insiders have always had oceans of it to support their revolutionary aims and activities because they have always gone to such pains to bring men with money into their fold. They have also taken many brilliant steps, not only to get more and more money into their own hands or under their control, but to reduce the supply available to their non-communist enemies. For one illustration, the Federal Reserve System was brought into our economic milieu with brilliant foresight, along with other Marxist measures which accompanied the rise to power of Wilson and House. For decades, the Federal Reserve System was run by good men and able men in what they believed to be for the very best interests of our country, which was exactly as the communists had intended, until the time should come when a fully accepted and highly esteemed American institution could then be used to serve the many Marxist purposes for which it had been designed. One of the most important of those purposes has been that very debauchery of a nation's currency, which Lenin himself said was essential to communist plans. But that is only a part of the picture. For central banking, as represented in fact by the Federal Reserve System, actually gives the central government complete control over both the money and the credit of the whole American economic system. And hence, it has put this mighty power directly into the hands of the insiders who have been and are using it in many ways to destroy the old order. Since we cannot cover the whole waterfront in this area, however, let us jump to another outstanding example which clearly reveals the depth and brilliance of the conspiratorial plans with regard to money. For lack of a better name, we call it the foundation system. It had already been set in motion before the enabling legislation for the graduated income tax was adopted. And who was there to realize over 50 years ago that the foundation system and the income tax were but two sides of the same coin? So today, these great tax-free foundations readily provide the means and methods for the insiders to accumulate untold billions of dollars in liquid funds to be used to foment revolution and to promote communist purposes. And this is at the very same time, of course, that confiscatory taxes are stripping all outsiders and almost everybody who would like to support, defend, and maintain the American system of the money with which to carry on the fight. And if you do not think that Nelson Rockefeller or Henry Ford II can use the billions in the respective foundations which bear their family names exactly as freely for their own pro-communist purposes as if the money were in their private bank accounts, then just study what they have actually and already been doing with that money, and you will surely be convinced. Section 8. The third great basis of the communist advance has been their creation, use, and exploitation of hatred. They seize upon every natural or traditional division among mankind over religion, race, color, language, or class as a source of hatred on which they can capitalize. They use every conceivable form of plotting and trickery to deepen and widen these original or latent rifts. Especially right here in our own country, do they fan into larger flames all tiny sparks of bitterness they can find or can foment between Jew and Gentile, between Catholics and Protestants, between labor and management, between whites and blacks, and even between youth and age. This is in order to make the situations which they thus create serve communist purposes of turmoil and destruction. The hatred, or supposed hatred, or whatever semblance or minute substance of hatred which the communist agitators could provide of the colonial peoples against their imperial masters has been essential to all of the communist efforts and advance in the name of anti-colonialism. The hatred, or supposed hatred, or fomented hatred of peasants for their landlords has been the excuse for all of the widespread crimes and massacres committed by communists in the name of agrarian reform.
Stop the cassette now and turn it over for the continuation of the program on side 2.